It was December 1988 in Three Rivers, Michigan, a quiet, snow-covered town where doors were left unlocked and everyone knew each other's name. But that peace shattered when 19-year-old mother Cathy Swartz was found brutally murdered in her apartment, her baby girl miraculously unharmed, just feet away. For decades, her case haunted detectives and her community. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this deep dive into unsolved mysteries, please hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment where you're watching from and what time it is, because tonight, we're revisiting a story of innocence, loss, and the relentless pursuit of justice, a case that took 35 years to find its voice again. But the truth? It came from someone Cathy once called a friend. In the winter of 1988, the town of Three Rivers, Michigan was preparing for another quiet holiday season. Snow blanketed the streets like a hush, softening the edges of sidewalks and rooftops, and the storefronts downtown twinkled with holiday lights. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, and if you left your porch light on, your neighbor might stop by just to check in. The pace was slow, the people familiar, and the winters, though long, brought a certain kind of comfort. 19-year-old Cathy Swartz was a familiar face in town. She was the girl who smiled at strangers, the one who always had paint on her hands from her latest project, and the young mother pushing a stroller along West Michigan Avenue. She had an unmistakable energy, a presence that blended warmth and resilience. Cathy had recently moved into an upstairs apartment with her fiancé and their infant daughter, Angela. Life wasn't easy, but it was hers. She worked hard, loved deeply, and carried the weight of young motherhood with pride. To her friends, Cathy was a contradiction in all the right ways. Sweet, yet stubborn, feminine but tomboyish. She'd just as soon be sketching flowers in a notebook as she would be trekking into the woods to hunt deer with her father. That duality made her magnetic. She wasn't just surviving in small-town Michigan, she was blooming. By late November, Cathy was looking forward to the holidays. Her daughter was almost 9 months old, and she'd started babbling in a way that made Cathy laugh until she cried. Their little apartment above the street had become a sanctuary, filled with baby toys, warm blankets, and the faint smell of paint and formula. Still, something unspoken began to stir. Cathy started mentioning to friends that she'd been getting strange phone calls, just heavy breathing at first, then a voice she didn't recognize. She never said much about it, just shrugged it off and changed the subject. But those closest to her remembered that she seemed uneasy. Her fiancé noticed it too. Cathy had started checking the locks more than usual. She'd peek out the window if a car slowed down outside their building. When he asked her what was wrong, she smiled and said it was probably just prank calls. Still, something had shifted. The town was safe, but it wasn't immune. Even in a place like Three Rivers, darkness could slip in quietly, unnoticed until it was too late. Friday, December 2nd began like any other day. The roads were icy, the sky overcast, and the air held that Michigan chill that creeps into your bones. Cathy was scheduled to work but didn't show up. No call, no explanation. Her friends grew concerned. Cathy wasn't the kind of person to just vanish, especially not without checking in about Angela. By that afternoon, her fiancé, who had been at work, tried to call home. No answer. He left early, his gut twisting with every mile. What he found when he opened the apartment door would remain etched in his memory forever. Silence. Then the soft whimper of a baby from the bedroom. And then, the scene. Cathy was gone. The young woman who had filled that space with laughter, art, and life was lying motionless, surrounded by unspeakable violence. Her child was in the crib, miraculously unharmed, but crying, alone in a room that had become a crime scene. The police were called immediately. Officers arrived to what would later be described as one of the most brutal crime scenes in Three Rivers history. Detective Mike Money was among the first to enter. What he saw stayed with him for decades. Cathy had been beaten and stabbed multiple times. There were signs of a struggle, signs that she had fought back. The room told a story of terror and resistance, but there was more. No signs of forced entry, no broken window, no kicked-in door, which meant one thing. Cathy had likely let her killer in. That one detail changed everything. In a town where people trusted their neighbors, where it wasn't unusual to leave your door unlocked while you ran to the corner store, it suddenly meant the killer could be someone she knew. The whimpering from the crib hadn't stopped. Angela had been alone in that room for hours, possibly overnight, hungry, frightened, crying beside her mother's body. The responding officers scooped her up, stunned by the surreal contrast between life and death in that small bedroom. Word spread quickly through the town. Cathy Swartz had been murdered. The news hit like a shockwave. Friends couldn't believe it. Her co-workers cried at their desks. Neighbors left flowers on the stoop. The Swartz family went numb with disbelief. But even as the community mourned, investigators were already working behind the scenes, searching for clues, collecting evidence, trying to make sense of the horror they had just stepped into. They didn't know it yet, but Cathy had left behind the first breadcrumbs in a decades-long trail, evidence that couldn't speak. Not yet. But in time, it would, and what it revealed would shatter the illusion of safety that Three Rivers had once taken for granted. Because the killer was closer than anyone imagined, and he had known her all along. December the 2nd, 1988. Snow drifted gently across the rooftops of Three Rivers, Michigan. It had been falling since the early hours, soft, steady, and quiet, the kind of snow that made the world feel still. But that illusion shattered the moment police radios crackled to life. A frantic call had come in. A man, Cathy Swartz's fiancé, had returned home from work to find their apartment eerily silent. No smell of dinner, no sound of the TV, no soft hum of a lullaby. Just the cry of his infant daughter echoing from the back bedroom. He hadn't been able to fully comprehend what he saw next. His knees buckled. His voice, barely audible, had trembled through the receiver. "I need help," he'd managed to say. First responders arrived minutes later. They climbed the stairs to the second-floor unit, unsure of what they were walking into, but nothing could have prepared them. The front room was undisturbed. No sign of struggle. Nothing out of place. But just beyond the threshold of the bedroom, the scene transformed into something out of a nightmare. Cathy Swartz lay lifeless on the floor. Her body bore the signs of unspeakable violence. Blood pooled around her, seeping into the carpet. Her skin was mottled with bruises. Defensive wounds marked her arms and hands, evidence that she had fought with everything she had. She'd been beaten, stabbed, strangled. Nearby, in the same room, her 8-month-old daughter Angela was crying from inside her crib, miraculously unharmed, innocent eyes staring out at a world that had just turned violent. Detective Mike Money, now a seasoned sergeant then a young officer, was among the first to see the scene. He would later describe it as one of the most haunting of his entire career. Any adjective you can think of to describe a brutal, violent scene. It was there, he would say. The room looked like a battlefield. Blood on the walls, on the sheets, a trail leading to the bathroom. Inside the bathroom they found a bloody footprint on the tile, not Cathy's. It was clear. The killer had lingered. Possibly cleaned up. Changed clothes. The brutality of the crime suggested rage, but the cleanup hinted at calculation. That contradiction struck investigators hard. This wasn't random. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was personal. And yet no signs of forced entry. No broken lock. No jimmied window. Cathy had let this person in. Or they had a key. Evidence collection began immediately. The apartment was sealed. Crime scene techs moved with surgical precision. Photographs were taken, samples logged. Under Cathy's fingernails they found tissue. On her body, traces of someone else's DNA. In 1988 that meant very little. But it was collected anyway, catalogued, frozen in time. The murder weapon, however, was missing. The blade, whatever it was, had been taken from the scene. That told investigators something critical. The killer hadn't panicked. They hadn't fled in a hurry. They had time. They had control, and they had known Cathy. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. Dozens of interviews, friends, family, neighbors. No one had heard screams. No one had seen anyone leave. It was as if the killer had slipped in and out of existence. Inside the apartment, more clues emerged. A dislodged picture frame, a phone taken off the hook, bloodstains that extended beyond the bedroom, signs that Cathy had tried to escape. But the attack had been too sudden, too ferocious. Autopsy reports later confirmed it. She had been stabbed multiple times, deep, forceful wounds as if driven by someone consumed with rage. Yet strangulation marks around her neck and signs of blunt force trauma showed the killing hadn't happened quickly. Cathy had suffered, and yet she had fought. Investigators believed she had wounded her attacker, possibly in the face. The bloody tissue under her fingernails supported that theory. But in 1988, those biological clues were ahead of their time. DNA was a new frontier in forensic science. Labs couldn't extract profiles from such degraded or mixed samples. It would be decades before those fragments could speak. In the meantime, officers were left with witness statements and instinct. The fiancé was questioned thoroughly, as is standard. His alibi checked out. Friends were brought in, co-workers, former partners. No one raised red flags, but the nagging detail remained. No forced entry. Cathy had trusted her killer enough to open the door. That trust, investigators believed, had cost her everything. Back at the station, officers reviewed her call history. A week prior, Cathy had told a friend about receiving strange calls at night. Hang-ups, heavy breathing. She thought it was a prank. She hadn't reported it. Now it felt like a warning they hadn't understood. Detectives pored over her daily routine, who she saw, where she went. They compiled a list of people who had access to her, people who might have known her schedule or been jealous of her relationship. Nothing conclusive surfaced. The town, meanwhile, was shaken. Cathy wasn't a stranger. She was one of them. Her father was well known. Her daughter had been born in the local hospital. Her laughter had filled those streets, and now there was fear. Parents locked their doors. Women no longer walked alone at night. The idea that someone capable of such cruelty was living among them, and had done it without being seen, was terrifying. But more terrifying still was the silence. No note, no confession, no new leads, just a small child left behind, a fiancé haunted by what he found, a family paralyzed by grief, and a town learning, for the first time, that evil doesn't always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it lives just down the street. Sometimes it calls before it comes, and sometimes it walks away, without leaving a single fingerprint. But in Cathy's apartment, it had left something. Something small, something invisible to the naked eye, and one day it would speak. Three Rivers wasn't a place that held on to murder. The town had its share of bar fights, petty thefts, and the occasional domestic call, but a brutal homicide? That was rare. And when it did happen, it stayed with people. Not just the family, not just the police, but everyone. After Cathy's murder, the quiet streets of Three Rivers turned uneasy. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion. Friends second-guessed memories. And police began peeling back the layers of a town that suddenly didn't feel as familiar as it once had. They started close. The fiancé, the man who had discovered Cathy's body, was questioned extensively. It was protocol. His hands were tested for injuries, his timeline picked apart. But his alibi held. Co-workers had seen him at work, and phone records supported his account. Investigators found no motive, no signs of trouble in the relationship, and no indication that he had any part in what happened. Next were the co-workers. Cathy had worked part-time and occasionally helped out at a local business. Her colleagues described her as warm and cheerful, but some admitted she had seemed distracted in the days leading up to her death. One friend recalled Cathy mentioning that she felt watched. Another said she'd overheard Cathy arguing on the phone just a week before the murder, quiet but tense. The calls Cathy received, the late-night ones, were revisited. Investigators pulled her phone records, but in 1988, the technology was limited. Caller ID was rare. No recordings existed. They could see when calls came in, but not who made them. That dead end came quickly, so detectives moved outward. They looked into former boyfriends, old acquaintances, even men Cathy had gone to high school with. No one had a motive. No one had recent contact with her. But then came the rumors. Small towns breed them easily, and in the vacuum of answers, they spread like wildfire. Some residents whispered that Cathy had been seen walking home with a man days before her murder. Others claimed someone had been watching her from a car parked near her apartment at night. A clerk at the nearby grocery store said a man had come in asking for Cathy by name, though she couldn't recall the date. One of the most disturbing whispers came from a neighbor who reported hearing shouting from Cathy's apartment roughly a week before the murder. It wasn't enough to pinpoint a suspect, but it was enough to suggest Cathy had been afraid, and that fear had gone unnoticed. Still, every lead turned to dust. No one could confirm these stories. No names surfaced. The case was already slipping into the shadows. Then a glimmer of hope. Blood at the scene that didn't match Cathy's. It was found near the bathroom, where the killer likely attempted to clean up. It was smeared, partial, possibly the result of a cut sustained during the attack. Cathy had fought hard. Investigators believed she scratched or struck her killer. That small amount of foreign blood became their most valuable piece of evidence. But this was 1988. Forensic DNA analysis was still experimental. The technology existed in theory. It had helped convict a murderer in England just the year before, but few labs had the capability to process such samples. The blood was logged, preserved, and stored. It couldn't speak yet, but one day investigators hoped it might. The murder weapon was still missing. A knife, most likely. The wounds had been deep, purposeful. A sharp blade. But Cathy hadn't owned such a weapon, and nothing from her kitchen was missing. Investigators searched dumpsters, nearby woods, drainage ditches. Nothing. Whoever killed her had brought the weapon and taken it when they left. The funeral was held the following week. Hundreds gathered. Cathy's parents, numb with grief, sat beside her closed casket. Friends stood in the back of the church holding back tears, and her daughter, too young to understand, was passed between relatives clutching a stuffed bear. The service was filled with stories of Cathy's laughter, her stubbornness, her devotion to her daughter. The church was overflowing. It wasn't just grief that packed the pews, it was disbelief. No one could understand how this could happen in their town. And to her, after the funeral, the town moved on in slow, painful steps. But the case never did. For the investigators assigned to it, Cathy's file became something more than paperwork. It was a constant reminder of unfinished business. A voice in the back of their minds that never let them rest. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Leads dried up. Detectives retired. New officers came in, read the case file, and left notes in the margins. But no new answers emerged. Each year, Cathy's parents would call the department asking for updates. Each year, they were told the same thing: it's still open. We're still trying. In those early years, hope lingered. Technology was advancing. DNA testing was improving. Maybe, just maybe, the blood left behind would one day give them a name. But until then, they waited. Angela, Cathy's daughter, grew up surrounded by stories instead of memories. Her mother existed in photo albums and whispered recollections, a scrapbook of a life she would never truly know. The town treated her like their own, watching her grow, protecting her. But the shadow of her mother's murder never left. Inside the evidence locker, a vial of blood sat frozen, untouched, waiting. The one clue that, in time, might hold the truth. Back then, investigators couldn't imagine how important that single sample would become, or that it would take nearly 35 years for it to finally speak. The killer had bled. Cathy had fought him hard enough to draw it, but he had walked away, unnamed, unpunished. Still, he hadn't walked away clean, and one day, that stain would return. By the mid-1990s, the case file labeled Swartz, Cathy had grown into something almost mythical inside the Three Rivers Police Department. It was heavy, both literally and emotionally. Over 10,000 documents filled box after box. Interview transcripts, autopsy reports, crime scene photos, chain of custody logs, and scraps of handwritten notes from detectives who had come and gone. It sat in the back of a filing room, tucked away on a metal shelf that sagged under the weight. The boxes had been pulled down many times over the years, reopened in moments of renewed hope or fresh curiosity. But each time they were returned unsolved. The case remained open in name but frozen in reality. The leads were gone. No new witnesses, no confessions, no deathbed admissions. The killer had vanished as cleanly as he had entered Cathy Swartz's apartment that night in 1988. The small-town department had done all it could with the tools of the time. They had preserved evidence carefully and almost obsessively. Blood samples were sealed and stored in temperature-controlled lockers. Cathy's fingernail clippings, bonding with tissue embedded beneath them, were frozen. Fibers, fingerprints, and unknown hairs were bagged and cataloged. The crime scene had been a nightmare, but the evidence was handled with remarkable precision for a department of its size. Still, Science hadn't caught up. Early DNA analysis in the 1990s was primitive by today's standards. It required large, clean samples, free from contamination or degradation. Cathy's crime scene had neither. The blood, though promising, was mixed with hers. The partial profile obtained from the unknown male was too weak, too incomplete. It couldn't be entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database, and it couldn't be used in court. The killer's blood was there. They knew it. They could see it. But they couldn't hear what it was trying to say. Cathy's parents never stopped hoping. They visited the station at least once a year, usually around the anniversary of her death. They brought cookies. They shook hands with the officers, and they always asked the same question, anything new? Each time, the answer was kind, but heartbreaking. Not yet. Detective Mike Money had stayed with the department through those years. He'd aged in the uniform, grown into the role of senior officer, and carried Cathy's case like a stone in his pocket. He'd worked dozens of other cases, burglaries, assaults, missing persons, but Cathy stayed with him. There was something about her, he'd later say. You don't forget that kind of scene. You don't forget the child in the crib. You don't forget how angry it made you feel, that someone could do that and walk away. He refused to let the file collect dust. Every few months he would reopen it, flip through the pages, study old photos, reread witness statements. Sometimes he'd spend hours just staring at the crime scene layout, retracing the killer's possible steps in his mind. But years passed. Investigators retired. New officers joined the force. Young, idealistic, unfamiliar with the case's weight. Cathy's name became something whispered in training rooms. A lesson, a story, a reminder of how even the best departments sometimes have to wait. Then came the 2000s. DNA technology evolved. Analysts could now extract genetic profiles from smaller, older samples. Forensic labs introduced PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which could amplify degraded DNA. But Three Rivers didn't have a dedicated cold case unit, and budgets were tight. Cathy's case remained shelved even as the tools to potentially solve it became available. Money pushed when he could. He submitted requests to revisit the DNA evidence. But the early 2000s labs still struggled with mixture samples, especially ones exposed to multiple contaminants like those from Cathy's apartment. Still, he preserved hope. And so did Cathy's family. The vigils continued every December. They were quiet, heartfelt affairs, a dozen or more friends and relatives lighting candles in the snow, praying beneath a sky that never answered. Angela, Cathy's daughter, now a teenager, sometimes attended. She didn't remember her mother, not really. But she carried her absence like a name. It wasn't until the early 2010s that another wave of advancement began, and one that would eventually change everything: forensic genealogy. It started with the Golden State Killer, a serial predator caught using publicly available DNA data from a genealogy site. Investigators uploaded crime scene DNA, built family trees, and used old-fashioned genealogy research to narrow down suspects. It was tedious but effective. Suddenly, decades-old cases were being solved across the country. Names long buried were rising from cold files, brought to light by science that hadn't existed when the murders happened. In Three Rivers, that buzz reached Money. He had followed the Golden State Killer case closely. He read everything. He spoke to lab technicians in Lansing. He asked the Michigan State Police for referrals. Could Cathy's sample, the partial male DNA left behind, be used in the same way? The answer for years had been not yet. But by 2020, the technology had matured. A small company specializing in forensic genealogy agreed to take a look. They could use SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, to find distant relatives of the unknown male. Even if the full profile wasn't available, they could build a tree. The blood sample from Cathy's scene was prepped, sequenced, and uploaded. And for the first time in 35 years, Cathy's case took a breath. It was no longer a cold case in theory. It was active, breathing, moving. A file that had sat dormant for decades was now blinking on computer screens across the country, flagged by genealogists, studied by forensic analysts, connected by digital branches forming a family tree. At the center of that tree, a young woman who had died fighting, a mother whose blood told only part of the story. And somewhere in that tree, Her killer, still living, still unaware that time had finally run out. In 2022, an unlikely alliance formed, one that would breathe life into a file long thought dormant. The Three Rivers Police Department, carrying the weight of an unsolved murder for more than 3 decades, partnered with the Cold Case program at Western Michigan University. It was a gamble, handing over one of the town's most haunting cases to a group of college students. But the department was out of options and, more importantly, out of time. Cathy Swartz's case was aging, and those who remembered her were growing older. The Cold Case program wasn't just theoretical. These weren't students scribbling ideas in a lecture hall. They were aspiring forensic analysts, criminal justice majors, and data researchers, handpicked for their curiosity and tenacity. They worked in silence with a kind of reverence. They knew what they were touching. When they received the boxes, more than 10,000 documents, evidence summaries, photographs, and handwritten case notes, it felt like stepping into history. A sealed moment from 1988, frozen in paper and ink. Their first task was monumental. Digitize everything. Decades of records were scanned, tagged, and sorted into a searchable database. They created detailed indexes, mapping witnesses, organizing alibis, logging physical evidence. In the past, detectives had to dig through paper piles for hours to find a single name. Now it was searchable in seconds. They built timelines, not just of the day of the crime, but of Cathy's final week. Where she'd been, who she saw, what she said. They created relationship maps, color-coded and exhaustive, connecting Cathy to everyone she'd ever known in Three Rivers. In doing so, they uncovered patterns that had been buried under paperwork for decades. One stood out. A name appeared multiple times in Cathy's early life. A boy she had known growing up. Not a boyfriend, not a recent contact, but someone from her past. Someone who lived nearby as a child. Someone who had dropped off the radar in adulthood. Robert Waters. The name had been mentioned in passing by Cathy's mother in an early interview. "He used to play with her when they were little," she'd said. "Moved away, I think. Haven't seen him in years." At the time, he hadn't seemed important. No known connection to the crime. No criminal record. He wasn't interviewed, but the students flagged him. They added him to their suspect index. And when they cross-referenced that list with genealogical leads from the DNA profile recently uploaded to the forensic database, a chill passed through the room. Robert Waters shared familial markers with the unknown DNA sample. Not directly, but close. Close enough to warrant a second look. They brought this to Detective Mike Money, now nearing retirement, still haunted by the case. He listened carefully, flipping through the printed report the students handed him. "This guy?" he asked, pointing to Waters' name. "He was never interviewed?" "No, sir," a student answered. "But we believe he's related to one of the 4 primary DNA branches identified in the forensic genealogy. 4 brothers had surfaced as genetic possibilities. But only one, Robert Waters, had a known connection to Cathy Swartz. It was the first real break in decades." Moni's voice was quiet. "You may have just solved this case." The students didn't celebrate. Not yet. They knew this wasn't about credit. It was about justice. Their work didn't close the case, but it unlocked the final door, the one that led detectives to someone they had never seriously considered. Robert Waters had left Michigan years ago. He was now living in South Carolina. No arrests, no record, no signs of trouble. He had blended into the background of life. But his DNA hadn't. And now, for the first time in 35 years, police had a living person who matched the profile. The students' contributions were formally recognized by the department. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that their work had given Cathy a voice again. A generation born after her death had become her final advocates. And when they closed the file and handed it back to the detectives, they didn't know they were handing over the name of her killer, but they were. By 2023, science had become a voice for the voiceless. For detectives chasing ghosts, forensic genealogy was no longer just a theory, it was the sharpest tool in the shed. And in a small evidence locker in Michigan, a decades-old blood sample was about to become a case's reckoning. The DNA collected from the crime scene in 1988 had always been there. It had waited, silent but persistent through years of disappointment. Technology had finally caught up. Thanks to single nucleotide polymorphism testing, SNPs, investigators no longer needed a full genetic fingerprint. They just needed enough fragments to start tracing a lineage. The sample was uploaded to GED Match and other public genealogy databases, platforms used by millions of people trying to trace their ancestry. These weren't law enforcement databases like CODIS. They were civilian-run, filled with people searching for lost family roots, not killers. But roots have branches, and branches lead to names. When the lab's report came back, it pointed to a web of relatives, cousins, second cousins, mostly clustered around Michigan. One particular family tree emerged from the data. Investigators narrowed the pool to 4 brothers, all genetically close enough to be the match. All of them had lived in the region around 3 Rivers in the 1980s. But only one had grown up with Cathy Swartz, Robert Waters. He hadn't been on the original suspect list. Not interviewed, not questioned, just a childhood friend who disappeared into adulthood. Now he was in his 50s living in Beaufort, South Carolina. No criminal record, no red flags. He lived in a modest home, worked in quiet jobs, stayed off the radar. Unremarkable, forgettable, a shadow. Detective Mike Money made the call to South Carolina authorities. A request was made to interview Waters and collect a direct DNA sample. He agreed, reportedly with little resistance. Maybe he thought it wouldn't match. Maybe he'd forgotten the blood he left behind. Maybe he had lived with it for so long he no longer feared it. The sample was sent back to Michigan for analysis. Money waited, silently staring at the same photo of Cathy he had kept in his desk for decades. When the results came back, they weren't just conclusive, they were perfect. The DNA left behind in Cathy Swartz's apartment, the mixed blood on the bathroom floor, the tissue under her fingernails, all of it matched Robert Waters. It was him. The man who had once played with her as a child. The man who had vanished from her life and then re-entered it one final time in the most violent way imaginable. The arrest was swift. On a warm day in April 2023, South Carolina deputies took Robert Waters into custody. The charges were formal, murder in the first degree. He was held in the Beaufort County Jail, awaiting extradition to Michigan. News spread through 3 Rivers like lightning striking dry ground. For 35 years, Cathy's case had hovered over the town like a storm cloud. And now, the name, a real name, a face, a person. Tears fell from people who hadn't seen Cathy since high school. Parents clutched old photographs. Retired officers called each other in disbelief. Some cried. Others felt rage. Angela, Cathy's daughter, now an adult, released a brief statement. "My mother finally has a voice again. I thank everyone who never gave up." Detective Money didn't celebrate. It was never about catching someone. It was about speaking for someone who couldn't speak for herself, he said quietly. But the resolution everyone had waited for, the trial, the testimony, the chance to ask, why, would never come, because just 5 days after his arrest, Robert Waters was found dead in his jail cell. Suicide. He had hanged himself with a bedsheet, authorities said, alone. No note, no confession, no explanation. The final silence of a man who had stolen so much. And just like that, the chance to hear the truth, the motive, the method, the reason he chose to do what he did, vanished with him. For Cathy's family, it was a bitter twist. Relief collided with frustration. They had the name, the evidence, but not the closure. Not in the way they'd imagined. Still, the case was closed. The science had spoken, and it had spoken louder than any courtroom ever could. Robert Waters had lived quietly for decades while Cathy's memory screamed into silence. But in the end, it was her blood, her struggle, her final act of resistance that brought him down. She had wounded him, left her mark, and decades later, it was that mark that gave her justice. But one question lingered, one that no science could answer. Why her? Why then, and why, after all those years? Had he chosen to remain silent? The news broke just before sunrise. Robert Waters, the man who had eluded justice for 35 years, was found dead in his South Carolina jail cell. Deputies performing a routine morning check found him unresponsive, a bedsheet wrapped around his neck, tied to the upper frame of the bunk. He had taken his own life alone without a word. Word spread quickly. Before most people in Three Rivers had poured their first cup of coffee, they already knew. The trial would never come. There would be no courtroom testimony, no cross-examinations, no final moment of reckoning. Waters had made sure of that. For investigators, the moment was surreal. They had spent decades chasing shadows, working leads, nurturing a hope that justice, full public justice, would one day be served. And now that moment had been stolen. Again. The DNA was solid. The science was irrefutable. Robert Waters was Cathy Swartz's killer. That much was proven, but justice, the kind that answers why, would remain out of reach. Detective Mike Money sat quietly in his office when the call came. He didn't say much, just leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph of Cathy that had never left his wall. He knew it was over, he finally said, but he still got to choose the ending. For Cathy's family, it was complicated. There was relief that the killer was known, that the questions about who had finally been answered, but there was also frustration. He would never be forced to look at them in court. He would never hear their pain. He had chosen silence again, just as he had after the murder. Angela, Cathy's daughter, now in her mid-30s, issued a statement. It was brief and full of grace. "We finally know who. That's enough for me. My mom can rest now." But in truth, no one knew why. Why her? Why then? What triggered the violence after so many years of distance? Detectives reopened the archives, this time with a laser focus on Robert Waters. He had no serious criminal history. No prior arrests, no documented threats. But buried in the corners of his past, in school records and old juvenile reports, were signs. Violent outbursts. Discipline issues. A short stint in mandatory counseling during his teens. Rumors of cruelty to animals. Nothing concrete enough to label him dangerous, not by the standards of the 1980s, but today, those would be red flags. He had moved away from Michigan shortly after Cathy's death, drifted south, picked up manual labor jobs, lived alone, never married, no children. When investigators interviewed former neighbors in South Carolina, most said the same thing. He kept to himself, quiet, odd, but not alarming. He had built a life in the margins, unnoticed, unremarkable, until science caught up. In Three Rivers, the reaction was somber. No parades, no headlines screaming "case closed," just quiet. Conversations in coffee shops and family kitchens. Many gathered again, at the same church where Cathy had been laid to rest in 1988. The pews filled once more. Candles were lit. Only this time there were no tears, only a heavy exhale, a release of breath held far too long. Angela sat in the front row, flanked by family. She held a framed photo of her mother, young, smiling, full of life. There was no pastor, no sermon. Just a community together, sharing the silence her killer had left behind. Later that evening, people left flowers outside the old apartment building. A few notes, some handwritten cards, and beneath the cold December sky, a question hung in the air. Why did he come back that night? He hadn't lived in Michigan for years. Cathy had started a family, moved on. There was no evidence of recent contact. No letters, no phone calls. Had he been watching from a distance? Had something triggered him? Or was it a spontaneous act, born of rage, memory, or some deep festering obsession? No one could say for sure, but investigators believed this much. He had known her routine. He had known how to get in. He had known how to hurt her, and when he left, he took her peace with him. Now he had taken the truth too. In the end, the facts were these. Cathy Swartz had fought back. She had wounded him. She had left enough evidence behind to outlive him. It had taken science, students, and 3.5 decades, but she had named her killer. And though Robert Waters escaped the courtroom, he didn't escape history. His name would now live beside hers in every cold case study, every law enforcement seminar, every student presentation about the power of forensic genealogy. His silence was permanent, but hers finally was broken till, in the quiet winter wind that swept through Three Rivers that night, the question remained, what made him return after all those years? And had he always planned to leave, without saying a word? Even after the headlines faded and the evidence was finally sealed, the questions remained. Cathy Swartz's case had been officially closed, solved through forensic genealogy and confirmed by irrefutable DNA. But resolution is not the same as understanding. And in the quiet moments following Robert Waters' suicide, investigators and townspeople alike found themselves revisiting the one question no one could answer. Why? Why had Robert Waters come back after all those years? Some believed it was a crime of opportunity, that he had crossed paths with Cathy by chance, rekindling some buried impulse. Maybe he was passing through. Maybe he saw her from a distance, in the grocery store, at a gas station, walking her daughter in a stroller. And something inside him snapped. Others, though, suspected something far darker. Cathy had once mentioned receiving strange phone calls, hang-ups, heavy breathing, a voice she didn't recognize. At the time, she brushed it off, told friends it was probably a prank. But looking back, detectives wondered, had it been him? Had Waters been stalking her long before the night he entered her apartment? Old psychological profiles suggested obsession, a fixation born in childhood, warped over years of distance and delusion. He had known her, played with her as a kid, watched her grow up. Perhaps in his mind, Cathy had become something more, a symbol, a fantasy, a possession. And when she moved on with her life and became a mother, got engaged, that illusion crumbled. There was no evidence to prove that theory. But there was plenty to support it. The attack had been personal, intimate, not just in brutality but in proximity. He had used a knife, not a gun, not a detached weapon. He had been close, face to face, and the fact that there was no forced entry suggested Cathy may have known him, or at least hadn't seen him as a threat. Forensic experts, reviewing the evidence decades later, confirmed what the blood had always whispered. Cathy had fought. Hard. The bruises on her arms, the defensive wounds on her hands, the trail of smeared prints. They told a story of resistance. She hadn't gone quietly. Most critically, investigators believed she had injured her attacker during the struggle. The blood found in the bathroom, the tissue under her fingernails, it wasn't hers. It was his. In a tragic irony, her final act in clawing, pushing, surviving, preserved the very DNA that would one day lead to his name. Even in her final moments, Cathy had refused to be erased. It took decades for science to catch up, decades for the right people, the right tools, and the right questions to align. But it was her defiance, her unwillingness to surrender, that ensured justice wasn't lost. For many, that brought closure. A bittersweet kind. It couldn't undo the pain or bring back the years Cathy's family lost without her, but it proved that she mattered. That her voice, though silenced, had never truly gone quiet. Still, even closure comes with echoes. In Three Rivers, those echoes live in the quiet spaces, in the glance of a passerby who still remembers, in the church where her funeral was held, in the apartment building that now houses different tenants. People still slow down when they pass it. Some stop altogether, place a hand on the railing, whisper a prayer. To this day, older residents recall the sound of sirens on that cold December night. They remember the shift in the town's energy, the way people locked their doors a little earlier, looked over their shoulders more often. For years, Cathy's case was the thing people didn't talk about, but never stopped thinking about. Now, when they speak of her, it's different. She's not just a victim. She's a mother, a fighter, a reminder of what it means to endure, even beyond death. Angela, her daughter, has spoken sparingly to the public, but in the rare moments she has, her words have echoed just as deeply. She gave everything to protect me, she once said, and even in that moment she made sure I would grow up, that I would live, that legacy, Cathy's will to live, her courage in the face of the unthinkable, has left its imprint not only on her family but on every person who touched the case. From the detectives who never gave up, to the students who combed through decades of paperwork, to the forensic scientists who gave DNA a voice. It all traces back to a young woman who refused to be forgotten. And though Robert Waters took the truth with him, he didn't win. He may have escaped the courtroom, but he didn't escape history. And Cathy Swartz, whose final act was one of resistance, ensured that her name, not his, would be remembered. Cathy Swartz never made headlines during her life. She wasn't a celebrity, a public figure, or someone the world at large had heard of. She was a 19-year-old mother living in a modest upstairs apartment in Three Rivers, Michigan. She worked, raised her daughter, and painted when she had the time. Her life was ordinary, and that's what made her loss so devastating. In the years following her murder, Cathy's story became something more than just a cold case. It became a beacon, a case study, a lesson in persistence for investigators, forensic scientists, students, and for every family waiting in silence for their own justice. Her case proved a powerful point. Even evidence once considered too degraded, too mixed, or too old can still speak. That small biological trace, the blood Cathy forced from her attacker as she fought for her life, would one day serve as her voice. A voice amplified not just by science, but by people who refused to forget her. It began with Detective Mike Money, who never let the file grow dusty. Through years of transfers, retirements, and shifting priorities, Cathy's case stayed on his desk, in his thoughts, and in his heart. When others moved on, he remained, chasing leads that never panned out, staring at photos that never changed, clinging to hope that technology would catch up, and eventually, it did. When forensic genealogy entered the crime-solving spotlight, Cathy's case was ready. Preserved evidence, carefully handled decades earlier, became the key to unlocking a name buried in a family tree. A name that would have otherwise never surfaced. But the science wasn't the only hero. It was also the students, the young, eager minds from Western Michigan University's cold case program, who brought new eyes to old documents. They scanned, indexed, reconstructed timelines and noticed what no one else had, a name hidden in plain sight. Robert Waters. Their work didn't solve the case alone, but it created the bridge. Between past and present, between chaos and clarity, they gave detectives the foundation they needed to act. And they gave Cathy something rare in cold case: history, a team of strangers who championed her memory simply because they believed she deserved it. The partnership between the university and the Three Rivers Police Department proved that innovation doesn't belong solely to big city labs or national task forces. It can bloom anywhere, even in a small Michigan town, if there's patience, collaboration, and purpose. Cathy's case is now taught in criminal justice classrooms, used as an example of how forensic genealogy can change the course of an investigation. Her story is cited in cold case seminars, podcasts, and articles. A quiet name echoing loudly in the field of forensic science, and perhaps the most profound legacy of all lives in her daughter, Angela. Now an adult, Angela has taken up her mother's cause in a way no one expected. She speaks at panels. She lends her voice to organizations supporting cold case reform and funding for forensic technology. She talks not just about loss, but about perseverance. Angela once said in an interview, "For years my mom was a story no one could finish. Now I carry that ending with me, and I use it to help others write theirs." She's met with lawmakers advocating for increased access to genealogical tools for local departments. She's met with victims' families, some still in the dark, still waiting, and told them what no police report can, that it's okay to keep hoping, because sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes, all you have is a drop of blood and a box of papers, but Cathy's case proved that's enough, when combined with determination, heart, and time. For the detectives who carried her file through 3 decades, the closure brought by the DNA match and eventual arrest was more than professional. It was deeply personal. They hadn't just closed a case. They had kept a promise to Cathy, to her daughter, to her parents, who passed away before they could see justice served. They had promised not to forget, and they hadn't. Cathy's story now lives in a different space, not just in cold case files or court documents, but in the memory of a town that watched her grow up, in the determination of young students entering the field of forensics, in the evolving strategies of small police departments that once felt powerless against time. And in every solved case, Cathy's name is there, quietly, subtly, reminding investigators that even the faintest trace of truth can grow into something undeniable. But behind every resolution, there remains a somber truth. That redemption, while powerful, sometimes arrives too late. Cathy didn't get to grow old. She didn't see her daughter's first steps. She didn't get to finish the painting she had started the week before her death. Her family missed holidays, milestones, birthdays, all while waiting for a name. Robert Waters took more than one life that night. He shattered time, and though he never faced a jury, never heard a verdict, his exposure still matters, because silence was his shield, and science took it away. Today, if you visit Three Rivers and stop by the old church downtown, you'll find a plaque honoring victims whose cases were solved years after their death. Cathy's name is engraved there, not at the top, not set apart, but nestled among others, because Cathy would have wanted it that way, not to be elevated, but remembered, and she is, by a town, by a daughter, by a generation of investigators she never met, but inspired. It took 35 years, 35 winters, 35 Decembers where Cathy Swartz's name flickered like a candle in a cold Michigan wind. But in the end, her story found its voice. Not through confession, not through courtroom drama, but through persistence, through blood evidence stored carefully for decades, through handwritten reports and crime scene photographs reviewed by hands that weren't even born when she died, through strangers, students, detectives, scientists, who refused to let her name be forgotten. It wasn't just the DNA that solved this case. It was the decision made long ago to keep the evidence, to honor it, to wait until science could translate what Cathy left behind. A fight, a trace, a scream encoded in cells. In 1988, Cathy didn't have the tools we have today. There was no forensic genealogy, no powerful DNA databases, no advanced sequencing. But she fought, she bled. And in doing so, she preserved the one piece of evidence that would become her voice across decades. That's the part that lingers. Cathy didn't go quietly. Her courage, in those final minutes, became the bridge between the past and justice. And although Robert Waters chose silence in life, and again in death, Cathy broke it. Her name now lives in the files of forensic classrooms, on cold case panels, and in the hearts of everyone who watched the case unfold. Angela, her daughter, carries that torch, not in bitterness, but in purpose. She speaks not just for her mother, but for all victims still waiting for justice. Her strength is a living legacy of the mother she barely knew, and the truth she helped uncover. Thousands of families still wait. They sit in quiet living rooms with yellowed photographs, with birthdays that pass uncelebrated, with questions that echo louder with each passing year. Cathy's case reminds them, and us, that truth doesn't fade. It waits. Sometimes in a blood sample, sometimes in a dusty file, sometimes in the heart of someone who simply refuses to let go, and when that truth finally comes forward, when it breaks the surface after years in the dark, it's not just a case being solved, it's a promise kept to the victim, to the family, to the past. If this case moved you, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story deserves to be remembered. Every voice, no matter how long it's been silent, deserves to be heard. Cathy Swartz's voice was never lost, it was just waiting for the right moment to speak.